So turn to Hebrews 11. We're still going to be back in the Old Testament, but we'll kind of start with a passage in Hebrews chapter 11. Just quick way of review. Adam and Eve fell into sin in the garden. Sin, pain, sorrow, guilt, all of those things came as an consequence of Adam and Eve sinning in the garden. The promise comes that God would crush the head of the serpent through the seed of the woman. And we know, obviously, that pointed to Jesus, but they're waiting. They don't know who it points to. So really, all of Old Testament history is waiting on the fulfillment of this promise that one would crush the head of the serpent, that one would crush the enemy. We fast forwarded to Noah because the world, due to Adam and Eve's sin and that sin nature being passed down, kind of degenerated into more wickedness. And finally, God saw that the whole world was wicked, other than Noah, and He sent a flood to destroy all of mankind, basically started over. It didn't take long for Adam's sin nature to begin again to affect mankind, and God chose Himself one man out of humanity to be His chosen person, and that man was Abraham. And we talked about him last time, how God gave him a son of promise by the name of Isaac. Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob and Esau. Esau becomes the father of Edom, and known as the Edomites. Jacob becomes the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph, one of his sons, goes down into Egypt, not in a very positive way, according to at least his brothers. What they meant for evil, God meant for good. Joseph's in Egypt, and he's there to prepare provisions for not only Egypt, but for the rest of that part of the world during the famine. Jacob and Joseph's brothers and families end up in Egypt because of the famine. They settle in Egypt. We left off last time by pointing out that a new Pharaoh had come to power in Exodus chapter 1 who did not know Joseph. So Joseph is passed, Jacob is passed, their descendants are multiplying. A new Pharaoh comes to power who does not know Joseph. And that brings us up to where we are in the storyline of the Old Testament now. And obviously we can't touch on every story. Joseph is a good story to talk about, how it points to Christ. Moses, obviously a lot we could say about Moses. But I want us to look specifically tonight at part of the Moses story. Moses obviously was born in Egypt. It's during a time when Pharaoh is killing all the male infants because they're multiplying so rapidly. Moses is hidden in a basket in the river, and his name means drawn out of the river. It was Moses. He was drawn out of the river by Pharaoh's daughter, and she raises Moses in Pharaoh's palace. So Moses is given an education. Moses is given opportunities that others didn't have. And God chooses Moses to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. He sends Moses back to Egypt. He has to flee Egypt. He sends Moses back to Egypt through a message from a burning bush. And Moses leads the children of Israel out of Egypt through a series of plagues that fall upon Egypt. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the story of the flies and the lice and the frogs and all of that. But one just quick thing to point out about those plagues is the Nile turning to blood, these frogs, these lice, these flies, this hail, all of these plagues are directly linked to an Egyptian god. So it wasn't like God was just randomly rolling the dice and saying, hey, let's send frogs today. Or, hey, let's turn the Nile to blood today. These were direct attacks on Egypt's gods. So one by one, it is as if Yahweh God, I Am, is taking out Egypt's gods one by one. And the final god He takes out is Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh was considered a god in Egypt. So the last plague was the Passover, where the children of Israel were told to take the blood of a lamb without spot, without blemish, put it over their doorpost. Obviously, we can see how that points to Jesus pretty easily. And if they did that, then the death angel would pass over their home. But whoever didn't have the blood over the doorpost, the firstborn son would die. Well, Pharaoh's firstborn son dies, who is the next in line to lead Egypt. In a sense, God kills their God by taking out Pharaoh's son. And the children of Israel are then released to leave Egypt. and to go into the wilderness. In Hebrews chapter 11, I just want you to see in verses 23 to 29 that just like Adam had faith in the garden when God made him the promise that Eve would be the mother of all living and that through her seed one would crush the head of the serpent, just like Noah by faith built that ark, just like Abraham was believed God and was made righteous through faith, Moses also was a man of faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 23, we kind of see this summary of Moses' experience there, and it's all rooted in faith. In verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So it was by faith his parents hid him. Verse 24, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. Verse 28, by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. And verse 29, by faith they passed through the Red Sea, as though they were passing through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. So we see Moses is operating by faith. He leads the children of Israel out of Egypt. He leads them across the Red Sea. He leads them to the edge of the Promised Land. And this is where the faith begins to wane in the children of Israel. They send 12 spies into the land to search it out. 10 of those spies come back and say there are giants in the land. It's a beautiful land. It's a fruitful land, but there's giants in the land and we're afraid, so we better not go in. And 2 of the spies said, yes, we can take it. God is with us. God is going to fight battles for us. So let's do it. But the children of Israel disbelieve God, and they are turned away by Moses from going into the Promised Land. So these people are then sentenced to wander around the wilderness for 40 years as God waits on that generation, that faithless generation, to die out before He allows them to go into the Promised Land. As we think about that, I want us to consider 4 very important things from this part of the story of the Bible, this wilderness wanderings. And I hope it will show you something maybe you haven't seen before or maybe not understood before. The first thing I want you to see is that after leaving Egypt, the children of Israel were led through the wilderness for 40 years. Okay, that doesn't seem significant, but it is. So just bear with me. They refused to obey God, go into the Promised Land. So the Lord caused them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the older generation who chose fear of man over faith in God passed away. God led them through a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night, and they just went in circles in the wilderness, camping and waiting on people to die. It's not a very positive story, is it? Well, when that time period is over, Moses, because of all of his experience with the children of Israel, Moses gives them a book of the Bible that we call Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is literally a summary of the law. So he's written Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. We have Numbers. Now they have wandered in the wilderness for 40 years as all of these things have happened. And just before they go into the Promised Land, Moses gives them Deuteronomy. And he's reiterating to them the law. It is as if he's saying, you blew this one time, you've broken the law over and over again, now you're at the edge of the Promised Land, let me just give you one more crash course summary of what God expects from you. And that's what we have in Deuteronomy. It's a summary of all the law. In Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 2, Moses says, you shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that He might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not. So you see, he's writing this at the end of that time period of 40 years. And I'm writing all of this down so that you can remember this experience in the wilderness. So after leaving Egypt, the children of Israel were led through the wilderness for 40 years. That's point number 1. Point number 2. For 40 years, as Moses mentioned in Deuteronomy 8:2. For 40 years, God tested the children of Israel, and they repeatedly failed the test. We're going to camp out here just a minute, okay? Or actually, quite a few minutes. For 40 years, God tested the children of Israel, and they repeatedly failed the test. And there were many tests that they failed, but there were three major failures that keep surfacing over and over. The first major failure is in Exodus chapter 32. If you'll turn there, you are probably most likely familiar with this story already. Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 through 8. Major failure number one, they worshipped an image. Okay, so God has led them out of Egypt. He's led them across the Red Sea. They get into the wilderness. Moses goes up on the mountain. He's getting the law from God. And while he's there, he takes a little longer than people expected. And in verse number 1 of Exodus chapter 32, we read, Now when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, Come, make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Aaron said to them, Tear off the gold rings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. Then all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. Now, let's just pause there a minute and remember where they got this gold. I don't know if you remember in the story, but before they fled Egypt, they were asking their neighbors for all of this property, and they were giving it to them. So it was as if God spoiled the Egyptians' wealth and gave it to the Jewish people, these Hebrews. They put it all on. They go into the wilderness, and now here we are, a short time in, and they're taking all of the spoils from Egypt and giving it to Aaron to make a god with. And he took this, verse 4, he took this from their hand, fashioned it with a graving tool, and made it into a molten calf. And they said, This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. How ridiculous. You just took the Egyptians' gold, you watched this guy make a calf, and then you say, Here's the God that brought us up out of Egypt. Verse 5, when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. So the next day they arose early and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. And this leaves some question, because Aaron's saying we're going to have a feast to the Lord, and they're saying this is our God which brought us up out of Egypt. Is this a new God, or is this their representation of what they think God looks like, and they're making a graven image? We don't know, but whatever it is, it doesn't make God happy. Verse 7, the Lord spoke to Moses, Go down at once, for your people whom you brought up from the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have quickly turned aside from the way which I commanded them. They have made for themselves a molten calf and have worshipped it and have sacrificed to it and said, This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Major failure number one. They worshipped something that was not God. They made themselves a false god, or they made themselves an image of God that violated God's commands, and they worshipped it. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 13, remember, Deuteronomy, this is a summary of the whole law. Moses is giving it just before they go into the promised land to make sure they don't mess this up again. And what does he warn? What does he say in Deuteronomy 6:13? You shall fear only the Lord your God, and you shall worship Him and swear by His name. In other words, here's you a reminder, guys. You built a false god back when I was on the mount, when we first left Egypt. We're 40 years later. Let me just remind you, worship only the Lord your God. So failure number one, they worshiped an image. Failure number two, they complained against the Lord because they had no food. Exodus chapter 16. This is brought up often throughout the Bible as well as one of those low points in their history. Exodus chapter 16, verses 11 through 15. It says, Exodus chapter 16, we'll begin in verse 11. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the grumblings of the sons of Israel, the complaints of the sons of Israel. Speak to them, saying, At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So it came about at evening that the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew evaporated, behold, on the surface of the wilderness there was a fine flake-like thing, fine as the frost on the ground. And when the sons of Israel saw it, they said to one another, What is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, It is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. So here the children of Israel are. They've just watched God take down all of Egypt's gods. They've just watched God free them from 400 years of slavery. They've just watched God lead them across the Red Sea on dry ground, and not only lead them across to safety, but also cover up Pharaoh and his armies in the sea. And now they get into the wilderness, and just as quick, when their stomach starts growling and their mouth gets dry, they begin to wonder, is God forsaken us? And they begin to complain, and they begin to murmur, and they begin to grumble. And I think in one of our first sessions we talked about that term hangry. Right? It's a cross between being hungry and angry. You get so hungry, you get angry. Apparently they got hangry, and they begin to grumble and complain about God. Where's our food, Moses? What are we going to eat, Moses? Hey, back in Egypt, how quickly we forget the bad. There's lots of food, there's lots of good, there's lots of things that we could have filled our tummies with, and here we are in the wilderness, and what do we have? And God miraculously, graciously, mercifully, in spite of their grumblings and complainings, in spite of the fact that it had angered God, still provided for them quail in the evening, and in the morning they would wake up and there would be manna on the ground, just enough for each day. Now, the children of Israel are about to enter into that promised land 40 years later, and Moses reminds them in Deuteronomy 8 and verse 3, He humbled you and let you be hungry, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that He might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. They weren't living by that bread. They were living by the fact that this bread was coming down from heaven. Day after day after day, it was proceeding from the Lord. Third major test that they failed. Exodus chapter 17. Exodus chapter 17. We're going to read verses 1 to 7. They tested the Lord by doubting His presence and care for them. Okay, so they've worshipped a golden calf. They've worshipped an image. They've worshipped something other than God. They have grumbled and complained because they didn't have bread. And now they are testing the Lord by doubting His presence and care for them. Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 to 7. Beginning in verse 1. Then all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin according to the command of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink. Now, this is a problem. You got to have water, especially in the wilderness, right? So they've traveled to a place. The Lord's leading them to a place because they're not just haphazardly wandering. The pillar of fire, the cloud, is leading them, and He has led them to a place where there's no water. In verse 2, therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? There's the problem. The problem isn't that they expressed, we need water to live. The problem is they are testing the Lord. Now, how are they testing God in this instance? They're testing God because over and over and over again He has miraculously provided for them, and now they're putting Him to the test, saying, is God really going to provide for us this time? We know He's provided for us all of this in the past, but can we really trust God? Can we really believe God? Can we really rely on God? In verse 3, the people thirsted there for water, and they grumbled against Moses and said, Why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst." So Moses, clearly in desperation, in verse 4, cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do to this people? A little more, and they will stone me." And then the Lord said to Moses, "Pass before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your staff with which you struck the Nile, and go." Now let's pause right there, because this is where we may not really understand clearly what's happening here. Moses has been approached by these people. He's upset. They're testing the Lord. And you see this over and over in the Bible, like you tested the Lord at Meribah, like you tested the Lord at Massah, like you tested the Lord. This is the problem. They're testing the Lord's faithfulness. And Moses is upset. They're upset with Moses. And where does Moses go? He goes to the Lord. This is what he does. He goes to the Lord. He communicates the problem to the Lord. He comes back with a response, okay? So he has basically said, you people are testing the Lord. When you test your father, when he looks at you and says, "You testing me," is that a good, comfortable feeling? So here's Moses. He's saying, you're testing the Father here. And then he goes away to speak to the Father, like he's going to the other room. When Mother says, "You're testing your Father," and they go to the other room, they're not talking about what to get you for Christmas, right? They're talking about what they're going to do with you. So Moses has gone to talk with the Father, talk with God, and God says, "Go before the people with the elders and with the staff that you struck the Nile with." So now, this is not just Moses walking out. This is the people lined up to hear what is God going to say about how we've acted. You with me? And this is a pretty important thing that's happening, because Moses is not just walking along, but Moses has the elders with him as he's proceeding before the people, the elders of the tribes. And not only does he have the elders, but he has the staff that he parted the river with. This is big. Something big's about to happen. I'm sure they're a little nervous about what kind of discipline they're going to get. So verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, "Pass before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go." Verse 6, "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb." Now where's the Lord going? Moses is passing before the people with some of the elders with the staff in his hand. God is going before him to stand where? To stand on the rock. He's not standing among the people. He's not standing with Moses. He's standing where? On the rock. And notice what he tells Moses to do. "You shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he named the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not? Is the Lord among you or not?" When Moses walked through that crowd of people with that staff and the Lord went before him, what should have happened is Moses should have taken that staff and lashed every one of those people with it. And that's exactly what they deserved. But what does God do? God goes and stands on the rock, and what does He tell Moses to strike? The rock. God is saying, these people who have tested me deserve to be struck. But you're not going to strike them, Moses. I'm going to go get on the rock, and you're going to strike, symbolically, you're going to strike me. You're going to strike me in their place. And they're not going to get punishment, they're going to get water. And it makes me think that this might just be a subtle hint that Jesus, God in the flesh, would come, and rather than striking His people, He would be struck in our place, and instead of meting out judgment to us that we deserve, He would become living water. Deuteronomy 6:16, Moses wants to make sure they do not make this mistake again, and he warns them, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test as you tested Him at Massah." So after leaving Egypt, these children of Israel were led through the wilderness for 40 years. For 40 years, God tested the children of Israel, and they repeatedly failed the test. One, they failed the test by worshiping an image. Number two, they complained against the Lord because they had no food. Number three, they tested the Lord by doubting His presence and care for them. Third thing I want you to see, even Moses failed God. Now this is just tragic. Same story happens again. People are complaining about water. This time God says, speak to the rock. And Moses, who had much more meekness and patience than I could ever muster up, has finally run out. And instead of speaking to the rock, he strikes the rock. And God said, because you did that, you're not going to enter the promised land, Moses. You have suffered a lot. You've led these people out of Egypt. You have led them through a miserable time in the wilderness of their groaning and complaining and sinning and you interceding and holding the ropes for them, but you've messed up. You're not going in. In Numbers chapter 20, if you want to turn over there to Numbers chapter 20 and verse number 12. Numbers chapter 20 and verse 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to demonstrate my holiness to the people of Israel, you will not lead them into the land I'm giving them. I find that interesting that God sees Moses striking the rock rather than obediently speaking to the rock as failing to demonstrate the holiness of God before the people. And God had no patience with this. He says, you're not going to go into the land. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, Moses is recounting to them how they got to this point again, back at the edge of the promised land. And he said, let me, I pray, this is Deuteronomy 3, 25 to 27, let me, I pray, cross over and see the fair land that is beyond the Jordan, that good hill country in Lebanon. Please, God, have mercy. Just let me go across and see it, and then just let me die. But the Lord was angry with me on your account and would not listen to me. And the Lord said to me, enough. Speak to me no more of this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah and lift up your eyes to the west and the north and south and east and see it with your eyes, for you shall not cross over this Jordan. I'll tell you, I have pictures from the top of Pisgah. I have pictures from the top of these mountains that Moses looked out over the promised land from, and they do not do it justice. It's so awe-inspiring to just think, here's where he stood. And look, and you can see the Dead Sea. You can't see the Jordan because there's not much to it, but you can see across the Jordan. And you think, this is where Moses stood. And this is where Moses died. And God did something with Moses. We don't know, but whatever the case, Moses failed God and he didn't go into the land, did he? Number 4, Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land. Deuteronomy 3, verse 28, but charge Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him, for he shall go across at the head of this people, and he will give them as an inheritance the land which you will see. So Joshua, Moses' assistant, is charged with leading the children of Israel out of the wilderness and into the promised land across the Jordan that is parted. Joshua leads them across, he parts the Jordan and leads them across the Jordan into the promised land. It wasn't Moses, it was Joshua. Now, I want you to do me a favor and turn over to the New Testament to the Gospel of Luke. Gospel of Luke chapter 4. You may already know where we're going with this. Luke chapter 4. And we're going to begin in verse number 1, and I want you to see Jesus and how vastly different Jesus is from everything we just read. Okay, Luke chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. We'll read verses 1 and 2. Look what happens. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led around by the Spirit in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by the devil. And he ate nothing during those days, and when they had ended, he became hungry. Now, what do we see here? Jesus has just passed through the water. He's just been baptized by John the Baptist. And after he was baptized by John the Baptist, after he passed through the water, he's filled with the Spirit, led by the Spirit, not by a pillar of cloud or fire, but he was led by the Spirit around the wilderness, not for 40 years, but for 40 days. Do you see a parallel? Okay, verses 3 and 4. Now he hasn't eaten anything for these 40 days. He's hungry. He needs bread, right? So verses 3 and 4, what happens? The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." Okay, here's the temptation. Here's the test. You're hungry. Your stomach is grumbling. You don't have food to eat. If you're really God, turn that stone there into some bread and satisfy your fleshly desires. Satisfy your hunger. God had led the children of Israel out of Egypt by the hand of Moses, and they failed God by grumbling and complaining, so He fed them with miracle bread from heaven to make them understand what? That man does not live by bread alone. He leads Jesus into the wilderness without food, but Jesus doesn't grumble. Jesus doesn't fail God by complaining. No, He goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 3 and quotes it to the devil, "Man doesn't live by bread alone." Look in verse 4. Jesus answered him, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone." He's not quarreling against God. He's not complaining against God. He's not really worried about this earthly, fleshly, temporal bread. He's living on a bread from heaven, the Word of God. Where Israel failed, Jesus succeeds. And look in verses 5 to 7. And He led him up and showed him all the kingdom of the world in a moment of time. And the devil said to him, "I will give you all this domain and its glory, for it has been handed over to me, and I give it to whomever I wish. Therefore, if you worship before me, it shall all be yours." Israel had been delivered from Egypt. They passed through the water. They were led into the wilderness, and they bowed to the idol, which is really just the devil. In Exodus 32, the reason the Hindus worship 30 million gods is because sometimes those gods deliver. But we know that a God like that has eyes that can't see, and ears that can't hear, and mouths that can't speak, and feet that can't move, and hands that can't work. So how do they deliver? Because there's demonic powers behind those gods that keep the people enslaved to them. So they may have made them a golden calf, but the reality is they were worshiping not God, they were worshiping false God, and behind every false God is Satan. So now Satan just exposes himself and he says, just worship me and you can have it all right now. You can avoid the cross, you can avoid the shame, you can avoid the humiliation, you can avoid the rejection, you can avoid all of this if you just worship me now. And how does Jesus respond? In verse number 8, Jesus answered him, "It is written in Deuteronomy, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve Him only." Verse number 8 and verse number 9 through 12, He led him up to Jerusalem and had him stand on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you to guard you." It's interesting that the devil is again quoting God. He quoted God in Genesis 3, put a little twist on it. He's quoting God here and taking God to context. "And on their hands," verse 11, "they will bear you up so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Here, this psalm is speaking of Jesus. He'll command His angels concerning you to guard you. And on their hands they will bear you up so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. If you're really the Son of God, prove it. Or, if you're really the Son of God, test the Lord and jump. Back in Exodus 17, the Israelites failed God by doubting His presence and provision for them. Is He among us? He brought you out of Egypt with a mighty arm and an outstretched hand. He caused you to pass through the Red Sea on dry land. He covered up Pharaoh and his armies. He led you in the wilderness with a pillar of fire by night, a pillar of cloud by day. He provided them bread to eat. He provided them water out of a rock. Is God among us? What more evidence did the Israelites need to know that God was among them? And yet they tested God. "Moses, is God even here? We're thirsty." Satan comes and says, if you are the Son of God, God will catch you. Is He among you or not? Jesus, is He with you or not? Jesus, prove it. And it is as if Jesus says, you know, the prophets prophesied about me 600 plus years ago. The angels announced my birth, my conception to my mother and my earthly representative father. They announced my birth to the shepherds. John the Baptist pointed me out. God the Father Himself proclaimed from my baptism from above, this is my beloved Son. Do I need to test the Lord by jumping from the temple? No, His word is sufficient. And He quotes Deuteronomy 6 and verse number 13 and verse 12. Jesus answered and said to him, it is said, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Every one of those quotes is directly related back to one of Israel's big failures, and now they're directly related to every one of Jesus' big victories. You see this? And then verses 13 and 14, when the devil had finished every temptation, he left him until an opportune time. And Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about Him spread through all the surrounding district. Jesus suffered every temptation, and He came out of the battle victorious, and He returned in the power of the Spirit. Israel blew it over and over again and died in the wilderness. And Moses failed God, and Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land. What does Moses almost always represent in the Bible? Does anybody know? When they speak of Moses, what are they talking about? Are they talking about a man, just a man? When they say Moses, they're speaking of the law, right? Moses is synonymous with the law. We belong to Moses. We believe Moses. We follow Moses. We are people of the law. Joshua is the Hebrew translation of the name Jesus. And Moses wasn't allowed to enter the land. Joshua led them in. The law will never get us into the land. So God sent Joshua, Yeshua, Jesus, to lead us into the land through His life, through His death, through His burial, and through His resurrection. Jesus had victory. Where the Jewish people, where Moses failed, Jesus had victory over the devil. And the devil left him until an opportune time came. And we know at least one of those times came when He was in the garden, being tested, being tempted to the point of death. And He obeyed. He obeyed to the point of death, even death on a cross, Philippians says. And He went to that cross and He paid for our sin, the perfect, righteous, spotless, sinless conqueror of the devil. He paid the price for our sin, and He rose from the dead so that we can be brought into the promised land, not because of us, but because of Him. And not because of what we've done, but because of what He's done. Just another story in the story of the Bible that points us to the main character, Jesus. And next time we're going to pick up and we're going to look at the time between them entering the promised land and the time of the judges. And we're going to even see again how imperfect scenarios point us to Christ. But let's pray, and you'll be free. God, thank You for the night. Thank You for those that are here. Thank You for this story and the stories in the Bible that point us to Jesus. I pray that You've helped us to see Him more clearly tonight, and maybe seen Him in ways that we've not before as we look at Your Word. And I pray that You would open our eyes and ears to see Him more frequently as we read through the Old Testament, that we would see Jesus in its pages. And we'll thank You for it in Christ's name. Amen.